Hello. Well, here on the Redundancy Recovery Hub, a lot of our material is catered to those people who are being made redundant, those people who are finding themselves on the job market or taking time out to discover what's next for them. But there is another side to this. There are the employers, the HR people, the managers who have to make the difficult decision of who to make redundant and then to tell them. So with me today, I have clinical psychologist and director of the Bodart practice, Natalie Bodart, here with me today. And Natalie is going to share some of her learnings and experiences and her knowledge around how to make that redundancy decision, and also how to tell people the difficult news. So welcome, Natalie.
Thanks, Paula. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you. So before we get into it, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. So I run a private practice in Southwest London, seeing adults with lots of different mental health issues, but also running workshops. But the other side of what I've been doing is working with corporate organisations, so working into health centres in big corporate organisations, helping employees, again, with lots of different mental health considerations. But of course, what comes into that are some of these processes that we're talking about today, which is how to manage redundancies, how to cope on the other end of things, which of course you mentioned when you might be in line for redundancy or fearing that. So really happy to come and speak to you a bit more about that side of things today.
So I've noticed in the press recently, the press are hanging on to these tales, and they're not nice tales, about people who've been made redundant by text or, just told over a group Zoom and all those sort of things. And they're the examples of bad practice. But there are many people out there, many managers, many business owners who are, looking for some guidance on best practice. And, their intentions are good, and they want to do this in the best possible way. So putting aside, the legal and the HR framework, what have you got that can help these people?
I think that's really interesting what you were just saying about the things in the press, because I think that really says something about how difficult these conversations are to have, and how much we as human beings really want to avoid having these very difficult, sometimes very conflictual and distressing conversations. Of course, I don't know the context of those in the news, but these are not welcome conversations to have for anybody, I think. So, whilst those are not ideal practices, we can in some way understand how that happens. But I think for most people, they'd want to do this in a way that feels, that they're respecting their employees, that they're really considering them, but at the same time, it can be a scary process to go through. And I think sometimes that fear of approaching that can throw people off guard a little bit, and they can sort of feel like completely de-skilled to be able to have these kind of conversations. They may have a relationship, if someone's been working with them for many years, they may have recruited that person into the company or the organization. They may have trained them or mentored them. This relationship may have been building over some time, and it's a terrible task then if you're confronted with the really difficult job of having to make that person redundant, and especially if it's several people that you're having to do that with. And I suppose my job in that process is to try and sit with some of that discomfort and fear, and to think about, well, actually, let's try and think about how you work with this person, the kind of values that you bring to your job as a manager, as an employer. So, for example, if you're somebody who's very ethical, or you're somebody that treats people with respect and dignity, and you value open conversations, we don't have to throw that out the window just because this is a difficult conversation to have. Actually, what's very helpful is if we think about, well, how do we bring those values and the really positive aspects of that relationship into this difficult conversation? And it may well be, and it probably is likely, that this isn't the only and first difficult conversation that has been had with this person, or in general. So it's quite useful to reflect on that. What other kinds of difficult conversations have you had to have? How have you managed and navigated those? What's gone well? What's not gone so well? But on the other side of things, it's also very helpful to think about, what do you know about this person or these people that you're having to have these conversations with? Of course, they may all react and respond differently. We can't necessarily predict that, but we can have an idea about that. And so we can sort of think about, okay, well, if there's conflict in the room, how are we going to address that? How do you want to be in that situation? What might you need to be saying or not saying? What kind of body language might be helpful? If there's distress in the room, or actually if it's a very brief conversation, how do we manage that? So I think it's about bringing that person's values in, their understanding, their strengths, their skills that they already have, and saying, well, let's make use of all of that and really think clearly about that, because sometimes the fear of it can sometimes leave people feeling like they don't have any of that still. So it's kind of bringing all of that back in again. Hopefully that makes sense.
So would it be useful for somebody in this circumstance to actually think about all the possible outcomes? Someone might get distressed, someone might get angry, and what they would do in each case.
I think to an extent, I suppose what we don't want is worry. So sometimes when we're thinking of all the possible outcomes, it can get into a bit of a worry scenario. Yeah. What if this happens? What if that happens? And then if we're entering into worry, then actually that increases fear and anxiety, which of course has a negative impact on behaviour or planning. But it may be that we're thinking about, okay, so let's talk about, if we're talking about individual cases, let's think about this person that you're going to have this difficult conversation with and make redundant. What do you know about that person? What do you think might happen? How might they respond? What are their circumstances? How might this impact on them? Because I'm sure most people will have thought about that. So whenever redundancies, as far as my experience anyway, when I've spoken to people who've had to make redundancies, they're acutely aware of the impact that it's going to have on that person's life. They might say, I know that this person has got a family, they're the only income earner in that family. I feel really difficult about saying this. What are they going to do? So, usually there's already a sense of the impact that that's going to have. Yeah. So I think we can think about it to a degree, but I think we need to think about it in quite a contained way so it doesn't float off into lots of what if.
Okay.
So we need to sort of bring that back to a degree.
Okay. And have you got an example of somebody that you've sort of been through this process with and how they handled it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can think of a couple of examples actually, but I'll talk about somebody I work with in one of the large corporate organisations that I worked with. And so that might be a bit different to somebody who's maybe doing it from a small company perspective. And we can talk about that afterwards if that's helpful. But from this person's point of view, this directive to make the redundancies was coming down from elsewhere. So this was not his decision, but he was someone who'd been with the company for a long time. He was fiercely loyal to this company. He'd worked extremely hard to get to the position that he was in. He was really proud of his team. He had a relationship with every single one of them. He was really keen on the work they were doing and the projects that they were doing. He was quite excited about that. And then every so often there would come this directive that there had to be redundancies made. And for him, it had sort of worn away at him, actually. I think for a time he'd managed it all right, but I think it had gone to a point where he just thought, I just cannot keep doing this. It's really conflicting with who I am and these relationships. And it was also conflicting with the team, really. We can't be doing these exciting projects if we don't have the people to do them. And so he was just in such a conflicted place about all of this. Should he stay? Should he go? What should he do about this? He was fighting their corner, making business cases. So I think he was in such a position of kind of wrestling with all of these different dilemmas.
He sounds really invested in his team. Yeah.
Say that again, sorry.
He sounds really invested in his team.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that is representative of employers in general, or managers or managing directors in general, that, it's sort of your family, isn't it, a little bit, that you've nurtured and grown them, you've recruited them, and you can be really proud of the team that you've created. So this is not a good position to be in when life or circumstance, things that are outside of your control, means that it just can't continue that way, that there needs to be redundancies made. And it's normally a last resort as well. I think that's important to think about that wider context as well, because sometimes we can get, it's that person's fault, or it's they're doing it to me. But actually, lots of this is wider context stuff. So he was really struggling with all of that. And so what we did together was just to really say, well, let's understand you. Let's understand who you are as a manager, what's important to you, the things that you value about your team and managing your team. And let's think about the loyalty and the commitment that you have and these good relationships that you have. And let's also separate what's in your control and what's not in your control. Because you can, of course, make a business case and fight back against redundancy, but ultimately, it may be that there's not much that can be done about that. So we have to sit with a bit of discomfort about that. We have to sit with some level of acceptance that this probably is what's going to happen, at least to some people. And so if we can sit with that discomfort and that lack of control to a degree, then the next question is, well, how do you then approach this process in a way that's true to you, so that you feel that you are doing the best job that you can do in having these conversations, making these very difficult decisions. And we thought about that and about, well, how can you then approach these conversations with dignity? What are your verbals, your non-verbal communication? How do you look after yourself? So we talk quite a lot about self-care. How do you look after yourself during this very difficult time? You know, do we need to plan a bit more of a break-in around this so that you're not feeling really stressed and upset, because that's going to make everything much harder as well. So we sort of navigated that together, and we also challenged some rules. You know, it shouldn't be this way, and you know, I shouldn't have to do this, and we could probably say, yeah, that, you know, I can understand that, but at the same time, you know, sometimes life is like this. Yeah. You know, and that, I think that's sometimes some of the hard truths about some of these things, that we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes life is just difficult and chaotic. And of course, we've been through an incredibly difficult period this year. And we're all having to sit with a lot more discomfort and difficult decisions like this. So we came at it from those different angles, and he worked through it very well and put things into practice, and did very well, actually, and decided ultimately to stay in his role and with the company. But, you know, that's not to say that it was difficult to navigate all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it really struck me what you said about acknowledging that it is difficult and sitting with the discomfort, because we're often keen to make ourselves feel better, you know, just, you know, look for the silver line and all that sort of thing. And sometimes there just isn't one, and we have to sit with that and recognize it.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of being able to say, I know, I'm so sorry. You know, it's that I can't make it better. Actually, I can't make it better, and I can't make a different decision here. And this is extremely regrettable. And I think, you know, sometimes that's that, you know, and that's very hard. I think, yeah, we're not good at that. I don't think we want to move towards things being generally positive and good and better, rather than having to deal with that difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of tough decisions and tough conversations going on out there right now that people are having to deal with that. Well, you know, I think we've actually covered a lot so far. You know, the fact that, you know, looking at your values, what sort of manager, what sort of leader, you know, do you feel yourself to be, and bring in those qualities to those difficult conversations, thinking about the other person, from your knowledge of them, how they might react, and again, thinking back at yourself, if you've finding this difficult, taking time out for yourself, the self-care thing that you talked about, and accepting that it is going to be difficult. And it is something that we've got to get through.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is that, having realistic expectations of yourself as much as anything else, to know that, you know, you're not going to be able to just do one after the other. You know, that's just probably a bit too much to ask of yourself, actually. And, you know, to really just think about quite simple, practical things that you can put in place about, well, how can you make this okay for you, actually? What do you need to do in between these different conversations, and looking after yourself during that process as well.
Yeah, and I think there is something to be said for acknowledging that they are difficult and they are upsetting, and that is part of being human, isn't it? Seeing, You know, we don't like seeing other people impacted negatively.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I suppose for bigger organizations, there's lots of rules normally about, how, you know, what you can say and what you can't say. And some of these conversations are very prescriptive. And that's difficult because you're then very restricted in terms of, well, I'd quite like to be able to say this, but I can't. And so in that case, we might be thinking about, okay, well, how do you express that just in your body language and your facial expressions? How do you bring it into the room, even if you're a bit restricted in terms of what you can and can't say? But for other people where there's not so much of that rules and regulations around that, so perhaps in smaller organizations, smaller companies, then there's a bit more free reign on that, which is nice. So you can have a little bit more flexibility in those conversations. But at the same time thinking about, okay, well, but we still need to keep that contained in some way in terms of, you know, what's reasonable to say, what you want to say, but actually what's best left outside of that conversation for perhaps another conversation or a different forum. So, so it sort of depends on your context as well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course you have to remember the person on the receiving end of these conversations, the employee who is being made redundant. You know, they may not be taking a lot in at this particular time, apart from the fact that they've been made redundant.
Yes, well, that's a very good point actually, because of course we know when our emotions are high and our sort of threat systems in action in our brains, of course our capacity to think rationally and clearly is out the window at that point in time. We can't really expect ourselves to always know. So yeah, I think that's really important to think about that as well, that it may be that there's not much response. How do you deal with that actually? So these different scenarios are quite important and useful to think about. And actually from a psychological and you know, a neuropsychological point of view, these are all very useful things to know about actually. Well, why is that person being very quiet? I didn't expect them to react like that. And again, we can sort of think about, well, how does the brain operate in these kinds of situations if it's a complete shock? And for some people it will be a complete shock, for other people less so. And so again, it's kind of bringing that context in of what's the journey been to this point in having these conversations.
Yeah, and everyone will be different. You will not be able to you know, do one and then hope to replicate it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Natalie. It's been really useful today, and quite enlightening to actually look at things from the other side, from the side of the people who are having to have these difficult conversations. So all details will be below the video, so you can get in touch with her. And once again, thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Bye-bye.